This is really an important time to speak up, and that's not easy to do. It's not always popular. There's power in speaking up, and there's power in doing it in whatever way you can.
Welcome to Just Healing.
Where we say the quiet stuff out loud.
I'm Dr. Debra.
I'm Michael Munson.
Join us to laugh, cry, cringe, heal.
Not necessarily in that order.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of Just Healing. I am so excited to talk about this week. We have a great person on. As you know, I always introduce you to wonderful people in my life and people who have meant something to me. And so I have Dr. Andrea Barnes coming on today to talk about, well, a lot of things, but mentorship and education and I don't know, whatever comes out of this podcast. So Dr. Barnes, hello, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself with your wonderful background.
Hello, I'm thrilled to be here. This is really fun. Yeah, in trying to summarize my background, I have to first say I like to keep learning. And so I do a lot of things, and it looks may look a little excessive to some people, but it's a way to keep learning. So, for example, I went to Wellesley College, and then I went to the University of Michigan and got a PhD in psychology. I worked with young children and neurodevelopmental assessment for a while, and then went to law school and decided to uh, become a lawyer. And ever since then, I've been looking at places where I can combine those two fields. So I went to law school partly because I am always very aware of power differences, and I just want to kind of know how the world worked. I felt like there was this secret that the lawyers knew about that I wanted to know because that's where the power seemed to be. But I've combined those two fields in a variety of settings, from academic settings, teaching in a forensic psychology program, to working with the Department of Correction to uh, evaluate and serve as an expert witness on the dangerousness of sex offenders. I do child custody evaluations in probate court, and at one point, I had time to write a book that called The Handbook of Women's Psychology and the Law, which tried to integrate all of those areas. So I'm always looking for new things to learn. And recently, I've been taking that combination of psychology and law to advocacy and talking to legislators and working on legislation at the state level primarily around issues that were important to me and to psychology. So that's a brief summary.
Well, and it's a lot because I met you when I was in graduate school and I was a hot mess. Like I remember meeting you and I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to go through graduate school. I mean, I'd even went through a master's program and nobody actually mentored me, sat me down, and said, hey, you need to work on these things, or if you want this career in this, or you want this and that, right? And I remembered you were the only person who did that. And you didn't do it in a way that I felt like you were singling me out. You did it in a way that was so supportive that I was like, okay, I got it now. Like I had no idea what to do. And I was like, wow, that's what mentorship is. That's what it means to care about somebody and want to see them succeed, because you had no stake in this game. And it's so funny. I talked to you like last week. You're like, you had no idea what an impact you had on my life. But that's true mentorship to me, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Mentorship has taken on a weight that I think does it a disservice, in the sense that, peer people saying, "Oh, you have to find a mentor," and it's like, I mean, didn't have many mentors, but I had teachers here and there who were supportive or just who saw me. And that made all the difference. And I mean, from fifth grade to graduate school, I can remember the teachers who saw me as a person and the ones who just saw me as a member of the class. And it does make a big difference, those individual connections.
And I was like, wow, like that's how it is. And I remember I asked you for a letter of recommendation
Mm.
to get my internship or whatever it was. I didn't realize, I just thought, you're teaching me, you told me all this stuff and it meant so much to me, but I didn't realize that you saw this value in me because you listed all of these strengths that I had. And I remembered that and I went, oh my gosh, like, this is like a mutual admiration like we're having here. And but I didn't even notice it. Like,
Right.
it was just so seamless to me, you know?
Well, and I'm glad to be proven true, I was right. So, all of these things have come through and you've created a pretty impressive career so far, so that's nice to know.
Yes. And it brings us to today because there's so many things people don't realize. Like we have all of these things happening in the world, like with higher education, with people, having all these different statuses in the world. And I'm just wondering, like, how, with all of this stuff going on, how are people going to grow? How are people going to, if they want something in higher education, how would they even get there? Like, what is something that could really assist in that?
In getting an education or
Getting
in
there, even thinking you can. Like, I mean, this is a
yeah,
crazy climate.
yeah. It is, and I think I find myself, zooming out, if that's the right way to say it, to the bigger picture, and because, there's so much inc anxiety everywhere, and it's hard to just get through the day, and if you're also trying to, um, go to school or plan a future, and it's really a frightening time right now because I don't think anybody feels very secure. And then we see governments that do things that we really don't agree with and who don't seem to have our interests at heart, from what I can tell anyway. It's scary, and I think it's an unusual time historically that we have to sort of acknowledge. Uh, and it's I find myself going in two directions. One is what kind of personal self-care and growth can I do in this moment to tolerate the craziness around us? And then what can I do in terms of fighting back or advocacy or
Mm,
resisting or protesting or working at the state level, or what can I do that might make a difference? And I think when you talk about yourself as a graduate student, I think we all feel very insecure at that time, and I'm not sure. I think you hit it well. I don't think you seem so insecure at the time, but I think that's the way it is. People put on a good front, and then when they're just terrified inside, and I've just lost my train of thought.
well, no, it brings me to the next point that I think that I was thinking about was, there's a lot of things people don't get about in group, out group stuff, right? And and if you're in the group, if you're out of the group, makes a difference in how you navigate the world, right? And you do a lot of stuff. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, and this is where I really fall back on some of my legal education, because I think there is a way that these in groups and out groups are formal in a lot of ways. They're structured, they're built into institutions, they're whether it's the way people compete for school, the way people get jobs. Um, some of these are so institutionalized that it 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 creates a class system that doesn't need to be there. Just as an example, in the law, when you go to law school, your first semester of the 3 years of law school determines your entire career. Because
Hmm.
what happens is you go in and you take classes for a few months, and then how you do on those classes determines what you do that summer, which then determines and first year grades determine where you get your second year clerkship, whether you're going to go to a big firm or not get one. And it's the craziest system, but it's built and it's built. There's a built-in bias in favor of people who have either had unusual experiences with the law, have families that come from the law, have studied the law before. I mean, or not. If it's almost like you have to know the law in order to go before you go to law school in order to do well enough to get the best paying jobs. So it's a built-in class system, for lack of a better word, but and it's so blatant that I'm amazed they let themselves get away with it, but it really does create a very rigid system. And once that happens, again, in your very first semester of law school, your entire career is sort of shaped. And that's just one example. I think that happens in more subtle ways in a lot of other settings. I was recently talking to some people about the APA wants to create a new professional test to expand on so that now you have two licensing tests to take before you get licensed. And there's some controversy about that, whether it's needed, whether it's just an additional burden for people who are already financially strained or um, aren't great test takers or for whatever reason. But and as good psychologists, they do the research and they check the statistics and they say, well, it turns out that the people who go to the most elite colleges or the most elite graduate schools get the best scores. And it's like, yeah, that doesn't sound quite fair, especially since this is at the end of graduate school. So even if you were, you know, whether you got into the best or the worst or somewhere in between, by the time you're done with graduate school, you should know the information so that you can take the test, right? But there's still that bias in favor of the most privileged students, even at the end, and is built right into the licensing process. And this
Mhm.
second test becomes controversial because that it just makes it solidified even more. So, it can
It's a
be a little
cycle.
discouraging to see all these kinds of things that are not only not getting dismantled, but are being, you know, s- um,
Well, it's a cycle, right? And so people don't realize when you make one change, there's people who are a rippling effect, right? And so like here's a great example. If you have a big wildfire, right, that happens, in the world, people are devastated, right? And lots of things happen, right? But they don't realize that the people who are working and cleaning your house or you are doing your gardening, like all of these things, those jobs are gone for the economy, right? So those aren't people who are in higher education, right? So then you have a big rift of people who are in different social classes, right? Now, those people who are in different social classes, they decide, okay, I'm going to go seek higher education. I'm going to go to law school, right? Or I'm going to go to become a psychologist. But now you
mhm,
add on an exam.
mhm,
Right?
mhm,
Now, if you haven't been prepared to go to law school and you don't know anything about the law, but you know that you did well and you tested well on these tests to get you in law school, but
mhm,
you don't
mhm,
have a background, your whole family's not in law,
mhm,
right? You're starting off at a different starting block. If you have
mhm,
financial aid, now you got to take a test that costs a lot of money. It costs us a lot of money to take all these tests to get licensed,
mhm,
right? Now you're
uh-huh,
adding on a test.
mhm,
You don't
uh-huh,
have the money to do that. And guess what?
mhm.
If your family's been affected by these wildfires, they don't have the money to help you. So you've been
Right,
going to school this whole time and you
right,
can't finish because of this one thing that you're adding on when the system's been working just fine before that, right? So now your system's adding on something to add on for what? To make money? To do something to keep things separate for certain people who don't have the same starting block? Whatever the thing is, you have all of these barriers, these things that are surrounding somebody, right? I've talked about one-on-one interactions in that example. I've talked about big interactions. I've talked about the exto interactions of going to school and work. But people don't realize when you make a decision to take away something in our society, all of these other things, right, come into effect for people and keep that in group, out group
mhm,
happening
mhm,
for a lot of people.
mhm. Of course, and there's when you create those kind of in groups and out groups, it becomes a generational issue. The person
Hmm.
who, just using law school as an example, the person who goes to law school and you know, doesn't get the big jobs, which most of them don't, still has the same debt and may even have the same more student debt. And they're going to be earning less and it's going to be harder to get out of debt. Law is a you're already doing well enough if you get to that point, but that's also true at the undergraduate level or you right. I mean, this is no time to be taking away people's supports, and that's really what we're seeing. A lot of the advocacy I was doing recently had to do with getting access to mental health services,
Hmm.
and those same kind of barriers are there all over. Sorry, my phone is quacking. Let me just get that. So a lot of the advocacy had to do with just getting access, and having insurances cover things that they didn't cover. And this has been a long-standing struggle in psychology because the rules keep changing and some services get covered and some don't, and the rates of pay are difficult. And um, but e- every time you sort of demean the provider, you're preventing those services from happening. If the providers aren't getting paid enough, that they're not going to go into the field, and then you have less providers for mental health. And we've seen that shift in medicine. We've seen the shift in a lot of the mental health services that a lot of people don't go into them anymore because it's just too much trouble. It's too expensive in education for what you get back from it, and that leaves a lot of people struggling to find services.
Right. And I always tell people, like, if you're a psychologist or a therapist, you will always have a job. But then they say, but really, like, is it worth all of that? Because because of all of the stuff with managed care. And then that brings us into, like, you think about it, like, this is my heart. This is who I am. I will always do these things, right? But it brings in a diversity factor, right? It's not
Mm.
just social class. It's not just, phenotype, the way you look, and people making judgments. There are all these other social factors that are diverse issues that go into treatment and who gets treatment and how that goes through our system. And a lot of times people don't realize that. And I know in your advocacy work, I mean, this is one of the things that I think you talk about, like how are we opening the doors because the doors are shutting, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, we're working really hard not to let them shut, but um, this is where I zoom back to the bigger picture, which is that we're for the past few decades we've been shifting from a culture that cares about its members to a culture that's much more supportive of capitalism, and
Mm.
of corporations, and gradually what's been happening is that the safety net for everybody is getting diminished. The benefits, the services, the things that you can rely on in or would like to be able to rely on from your government so that you're not impoverished, those are going away. And the people who are thriving, you have to be a multimillionaire to thrive in this culture now. Um and what the effect that has, I mean, it has the effect of creating a culture where everyone is financially insecure, where everyone's can be fired easily, where anyone can lose their job, where anyone could be bullied at work, and the more financially insecure you get, the more you want to blame someone. You get anxious, you want to blame someone, and it's a great way to divide us so that now we're all worried about jobs or whether the job even is worth doing or whatever. But now we have this sort of constant anxiety keeps us again looking for reasons, and often
Mhm.
people blame the wrong things. They say, well, it's the immigrants or it's diversity or something when it's none of those things. It's the basic disrespect that the average person receives from their government now, and the lack of support. Recently had a conversation with someone, and I try to avoid these, but sort of a conversation with someone who was on a neighborhood website who was praising recent government actions that were gutting the government, basically. He was saying, oh, we need this at the state level and at the town level. And I couldn't resist asking him a little bit more about why he thought this was good, and the subject got on to education and science labs, and he had no idea what he was talking about. I asked him, "Have you ever been in a research lab?" Because he thought, "Well, they need to do their share too before the government gives them anything." And he had no idea about any of it, but he had the emotion. And when he couldn't sort of answer the factual questions, he said, "They're all stealing from me. They have to stop stealing from me." I thought, "Wow." You know, I don't know how he got there, but somehow that's where it gets. People are so scared of being able to have a life, the basic needs met, that they start projecting. And if you watch the right TV shows or whatever, you know you find out that it's the scientists who you have to blame or something, it doesn't make any sense. What was striking to me was the intensity of his fear that people were stealing from him, and that's why we had to fight back. But it's terrorism, really. You keep the whole culture afraid, and then you can control. You have a lot more power because people don't know what
Yeah.
to do. You
Right.
know, I mean, people were making appeasing kind of behaviors even before our current president was inaugurated. Before he was in office, people were already cowering. And that doesn't make sense on a factual level, but it's what happens when you create a culture of fear and threaten.
It's history. And the people are forgetting the history of not just our country, the world.
Forgetting or not knowing in the first place, not understanding in the first place. I mean, this was very predictable, but I feel like we all need a review of our civics class. This is how governments work. This is why we need them to
Yeah.
do certain
And I think
things.
they took civics out of the curriculum.
Well, I think they did, and it doesn't get discussed as much. It's scary. It's really scary where things are going, but hopefully,
Yeah, it's scary. People aren't looking at what happened in our history. People aren't applying the knowledge, and you hit it on the head. Like, it's ignorance, right? It's not that, I truly don't want to believe people have gotten dumber in life. I believe we have not educated, and that's purely what
yeah,
ignorance means, right? You just don't know, right? So when we take stuff out of a curriculum, or we say, well, we can't do that because of this, because of your own belief system, but you're discounting why that was there in the first place, right? And so
right.
sometimes we need to realize those things are there for a reason. To just remove them, we're we get in troubling times, right?
Right, and one of the things that gets lost in the shuffle is critical thinking. Just the ability to look at what you're being presented and decide whether you should believe it or not. How do you assess what someone's telling you? Being able to look at the context, fact check, make sure that, they're telling you the truth or not. Our tolerance for lying is really bizarre. It's a very strange cultural experience to know people are lying to you and that there's no real sanction. There are no consequences. I mean, there are consequences because we're living them, but
Yeah, we're living them. They're not enforced on someone else, right?
right,
So
right.
that's the thing.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, people don't get dumber, but what information they get and how they evaluate it is varied. And that's partly a product of our technology and how everything's people don't sit and watch the 6 o'clock news anymore the way they did a generation ago. They pick and choose what they see, but I think if you want to do some critical thinking, you have a responsibility to pick and choose a few things, not just find one, not just go into the echo chambers that people go into.
Right, and people don't realize TikTok's not always accurate, and then they take that as the news, you know?
Fox News got sued last year or 2 years ago for their accusations about the voting machine. The
Yeah.
company that made the voting machines sued them for lying about them. And in that lawsuit, Fox News basically said, "We're not a news program. We don't have to tell the truth because we're not a." And they said that under oath. So they themselves know they're not presenting news in any kind of unbiased way. But I don't think that necessarily comes through to their viewers.
No, no, and especially if we're looking at the world is more ignorant than it is, right? Because I truly believe we're not still trying to figure out how to make a wagon wheel now, right? So we have gotten smarter, and we're going to
Mm,
keep getting smarter. We have robots and AI and all this stuff. But if we're going to be ignorant to things, if we take things out, and that's what's going on, and the world is like, no, TikTok, because we have all this technology, it has to be right, Fox News wouldn't lie to us, and no,
mhm,
you need to check those facts yourself. You need to have those skills. And those
right.
skills are what is causing a lot of the rift in the world today. But with all that, how do we fix this? I mean, Dr. Barnes, how do we fix this?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is really an important time to speak up, and that's not easy to do. It's not always popular, you know, but it's I always think, I think of, you know, Hitler era and times like that and all the people that were quiet while this was going on. And I think that's the I'm more angry at the people who sit by and let it happen than even the leaders and at times because there's power in speaking up and there's power in doing it in whatever way you can. I mean, I'm not a huge social media person, but that's a lot of people are, and that's great for them. And but there's been it's been nice to see that there has been political backlash. There is a lot of protest out there right now, and I think what we can do is what we've done in previous generations is you go out and you fight. There were protests and around civil rights or protests around Vietnam. Those they made a big difference when it gets unpopular to. And I think some of that's happening now. I think we can be as loud as we possibly can, and we can also, again, it's hard not to engage in a way that's unproductive and get into an argument with people who aren't going to listen to you anyway. But if you can do it in a way that's, um, legislators, congressmen, senators want to keep their jobs, and they keep their jobs by satisfying their constituents. So one of the things that can be very effective is contacting your senators and congressmen and saying, I don't like what's going on. Some of them have been upset recently because they get too many phone calls from constituents, but hey, that's sort of the point. They're there to listen and respond. So I wish I had the perfect answer, but I think what we can do is what we've always done historically is tolerate as much as we can and then fight back.
There's not much, we have to do our part in our one-on-one interactions. And those one-on-one interactions might touch someone in the bigger interactions, right?
Mhm.
And that's what I tell people. Like right now, we're talking about this. Somebody's going to hear this, right?
Mhm.
But also, when you're with someone and you see something, say something, right? The more people realize people aren't going to tolerate certain things, the more they
Mhm.
will respond because people like in groups and out groups. They don't want to be in the out group. And the more people say
Right.
that they're in this group, the better it's
Right.
going to be, right? And that's how we create change is not
Mhm.
being complacent. It's not about being silent. It's being complacent, meaning that, well, I can't do anything. I'm just going to be quiet.
Right.
That's allowing it.
Right. Now and there are always risks. I mean, if we and these topics are so intermingled because I think,
Yeah.
when you talk about diversity and those issues, you know, uh, how many times have you been in a conversation where people have talked over you? I mean, that's an everyday experience, you know, for women and a group of men. I mean, getting in a word in edgewise. So there's these everyday sexism and racism and stuff that gets old after a while. And I'm someone who irritates people by speaking up. And I, even though I'm saying it in a fairly kind way, but I'll say things like, well, you're making this statement. What is the research behind it? And they get annoyed that I'm calling them on it, even though we all know as psychologists that we're supposed to be saying what we say based on research. But it's I can't tell you how many times. Well, I can tell you there haven't been a lot of them, but there have been some key times where I've complained about certain things, and the response is, "Oh, you should be nicer." And again, I'm a pretty calm person. I don't go, I don't think anyone would naturally call me aggressive. But that is right out of Sexism 101. Girls are supposed to be nice and make everyone feel better, and if that's not happening, um it's not the fault of the workplace bully or the situation like that. It's the person who's not being quiet and nice enough. It's so those kind of biases come in everywhere. So you can speak up, but there is a cost to speaking up. And ultimately, you have to decide who you want to be as an individual, what your core values are, and how you can live with yourself. Because I will often speak up, and I'll sometimes people will be very annoyed because I said something that made them a little bit uncomfortable. More often, I'll leave whatever that meeting was or that class was, and 3 or 4 other people will say, "Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I didn't wouldn't have said it, but I'm so glad you said it." So so speaking up is important, just be able to express yourself and make yourself seen, but you're very likely speaking for other people who aren't that brave. I think it does take some
Right.
courage.
That's group dynamics 101. Sometimes you're the container, but as women,
Right.
we do not have to be nice. We do not have to be polite. We can be kind. I like being a kind person, but
Well, I think you can be
sometimes
whatever
being
kind of
nice isn't the
person.
right thing.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that whatever kind of person you wanna be, you should be, and you'll get a natural reaction. If you're too rude, people will let you know, but there is that expectation that, in a group, the women have to be nice, or they have to be quiet, or you know. Like I said, it's classic sexism 101, to the point where there was literally a Supreme Court case back in the '80s that talked about. It was Price Waterhouse case in a big accounting firm, where this woman was going up for partner, and she was getting evaluated, and she was an incredible producer, millions of dollars brought into the company. But the reviews that her coworkers gave her was more makeup. She should wear more makeup. She should go to charm school. Basically the idea was she was a little, um, I would probably say assertive, but it was also the thing that brought her $1 million into the company. So it's a very famous Supreme Court case that really defined that kind of sexist stereotyping. And in fact, it was, psychologists testified in it. There's some Susan Fisk, was a social psychologist who contributed to that case in a way that makes me proud to be a psychologist. But it's out there, but it doesn't seem to make a it's hard to it's hard to get people to
Well,
listen.
that is definitely another topic for our conversation, but this has been a very fruitful discussion. And I have so many more questions. I'm sure other people do. So you have to come back and we have to talk
Yeah.
about the other half of this. There's so much corporate stuff that we didn't even get to with being traumatized in the corporate environment. But go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was gonna say, I know we rambled a little bit, but it's all of these things are so intertwined that it's hard to skip over any of
Tease it
them.
out.
Yeah.
So what do you want to leave us with? And how do people get in contact with you?
If I can leave you with anything, it's the message to speak up and advocate. As a profession, we need to do it better. As individuals, I think everything you can do, and to not worry that your voice won't get heard, because you can send emails to your representatives, you can call them up, but they keep track of every email. They count them. Because it matters to them. And even if your email is one of, I mean, if it's one, good, great, they'll read it. If it's one of 1,000 saying the same thing, great, because you've added to that number in a way that really makes the point strong. So I guess I would, remind you that they work for us, and they are real people who are happy to have a conversation, actually, if you can, um, schedule it. So advocate, and advocate at the highest levels. Advocate with your federal government, with your state government, with your town, with your, speak up. That's what I'd
How
say.
do people get in contact with you?
I since I'm not really on social media, I think LinkedIn is probably the best place for them to just look me up.
Perfect. And that information will be at the bottom. And thank you for this episode of Just Healing. And we can't wait to bring you more topics like this. See you next time. If you'd like to learn more, get involved, or find community, visit menhealing.org.